This is our Changing State Vote 2024. I'm Matthew Peddie. During this presidential campaign, you've been telling us about the top issues you hope this election might change, and one of them is immigration. Some of you wrote in WUSF's online survey that you're concerned about the security of our borders. Others are worried about the rise of xenophobic rhetoric aimed at immigrants. No matter what your opinion, there is some agreement. The US immigration system is broken. Well, coming up, you're going to hear about the system's impact on jobs and taxes, crime, and asylum seekers. Well, WUSF's Nancy Guan has been reporting on immigration this year. Hey, Nancy.
Hey, Matt.
A lot of people have strong opinions about immigration, and in reality, immigration laws are complicated, and how the issue affects Floridians may be quite different than people realize. So let's sort through some misconceptions. And let's start with some terminology. What's the difference between an undocumented immigrant and an asylum seeker?
I'm glad you asked that question because the difference between undocumented immigrants and asylum seekers, that often gets lost in the immigration conversation. First of all, undocumented immigrants, they are people who are in the U.S. without legal authorization. But that could cover a broad swath of people in different scenarios. For example, they could have come into the U.S. undetected. That means they could have came in through the border without being apprehended by Border Patrol agents. Or they could have come to the U.S. with a valid visa, such as a tourist visa or a student visa, and overstayed when that visa expired. To put it simply, undocumented immigrants don't have the legal right to be in the U.S., and they also don't have work authorization. Mm-hmm. Asylum seekers, on the other hand, are actively seeking asylum or that refugee status. So they've either filed an application or intend to file an application to seek asylum. So they're at least on that pathway that could lead to citizenship, because if you receive asylum, you could eventually apply for a green card. But I think it's important to note that people who enter the U.S. without authorization or cross the border illegally can apply for asylum. And that's what we're seeing happen at the border.
When people say illegal immigrant, what do they mean?
So the term illegal immigrant is pretty fraught and has been debated for years. In short, it's not a formal term, but it's been used to describe people who do not have the legal right to be in the U.S. We've heard politicians, especially those on the right, use the term illegal immigrant pretty frequently, and I think it's fair to say pretty broadly to stoke fears about the immigrant community. I think it's important to note that the Associated Press actually dropped using the term illegal immigrant back in 2013 because it is imprecise, actually, and can be harmful.
Mm-hmm. And so that's where this idea of undocumented immigrant comes in.
Yes.
Yeah. So you've been talking with immigrants, advocates, and attorneys about problems with the immigration system. How does the immigration system work for someone in Florida without legal paperwork?
Yeah, I mean, someone who doesn't have legal authorization or legal status, it's really tough. They don't have a social security number, they don't have proper work authorization, so their options are limited. And they do not have access to a lot of social services such as Medicaid unless it's, in the event of an emergency, or SNAP, which provides grocery assistance. But at the same time, a lot of the undocumented community are working in jobs with lower wages. Mm-hmm. So, for example, our agriculture industry depends a lot on undocumented labor. And a farm worker advocate that I spoke with said that a lot of the undocumented farm workers that he's worked with are afraid to speak out against their employer when there's labor abuses. In addition, there's very few pathways to citizenship for undocumented individuals. So a lot of them stay undocumented. DACA recipients is also a group that I've spoken with. To give some background, people in the DACA program, they were people brought into the U.S. As children without legal status. Mm-hmm. But the DACA program lets them stay in the U.S. temporarily. And it gives them a social security, it gives them work authorization, so they can live and work in the U.S. as long as that program is in place. A DACA recipient that I spoke with, he really values the benefits, but he also says there's limits, right? So, for example, he's not able to receive federal aid. So when he wanted to apply for college, he had to look for scholarships, or else higher education would have been very expensive. Mm-hmm. At the same time, he told me, as a child, he was very afraid that his family's status would be exposed. Before the DACA program was created, he didn't even know if he'd be able to go to school, so he was living under a lot of uncertainty and anxiety for his future.
So it sounds like there are different kind of levels of documented status, if you want to call it that, for immigrants who came here without paperwork. And if there's one thing kind of knitting it all together, it's maybe a sense of uncertainty. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. There's a lot of different programs that are in place. There's temporary protected status, there's DACA, like we just said, there's humanitarian parole, and all of those programs have different parameters. But the people that I've spoken with who work closely with the immigrant community have told me stories that, families are often living in fear, especially if they're undocumented. Especially recently where, Florida has passed policies meant to crack down on illegal immigration. It's affected that community mentally and psychologically. So.
Nancy, you've talked with immigration attorneys in the Tampa Bay region. What have they told you about Florida's huge backlog of immigration cases, asylum cases?
Yeah, so the number of asylum seekers has been surging in recent years, and they've told me that the system simply doesn't work like it did maybe 10 years ago. An attorney that I spoke with who works in Lakeland said that the asylum process used to take 3 to 4 months tops. That's not the case anymore. There's over 2 million pending asylum cases in immigration courts and asylum offices across the U.S., and there's just not enough manpower to handle that volume of cases. They believe, there needs to be more funding, there needs to be more staffing to hire more people who work with asylum cases and in the immigration system. But they're also calling for, policy changes to make the system more efficient and reduce the backlog.
And so you have this massive backlog across the country, but Florida, it's worse, right? Or it's one of the worst affected states in terms of that backlog.
Yes. So in numbers, Florida has the most pending cases. It's close to 180,000.
Mm-hmm. Do they have any sense of how long it's going to take to get through all that?
So according to the data, it would take about 4 years for someone to have their first hearing. That's on par with the national average. But in a lot of cases, people are waiting even longer than that. So.
Wow, so there's a big difference between that 4-month time frame the attorney told you about in the first case and 4 years. That's a pretty massive shift.
Yes, exactly.
What is the difference between federal immigration law and Florida immigration law then?
So the federal government has the power to enforce immigration law. That's under their jurisdiction. Federal agencies, they're the ones who are in charge of deciding who enters, who stays, and who ultimately gets deported. But states and local law enforcement agencies can play a supportive role, right? There's been partnerships between local law enforcement and ICE. And states can also pass laws that ultimately affect the immigrant community. And we've seen that happen in Florida in recent years. Last year, they passed a sweeping immigration bill, SB 1718, that Republicans say was meant to crack down on illegal immigration in the state.
What about the impact of Florida's new laws targeting illegal immigration then? How are those laws playing out?
Yeah, so those laws have definitely impacted the immigrant community. I've spoken with advocates and nonprofits that work with immigrants, and they've told me it's created a chilling effect on undocumented immigrants and their family members. Going back to SB 1718, that bill did a number of things. It made it harder to hire undocumented labor, and it also mandated hospitals that receive Medicaid to ask emergency room patients about their immigration status, even though patients can decline to answer. And another major provision that got national attention banned people from transporting or driving undocumented individuals into the state. Although that part of the bill is on hold, it's being blocked by federal courts. But regardless, it's created a chilling effect on the immigrant community. Advocates have told me people have been afraid to go to work. They've been afraid to drive, afraid to seek medical care. And in Florida, we have about 1.2 million undocumented individuals. And it's also important to note that the laws don't only affect them, but it affects their family members, so there's a ripple effect.
Right. And of course, among those families, there are different statuses in terms of their immigration paperwork, right? So it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario.
Yeah, definitely. There's a large number of people who live in mixed status families.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Nancy, what about the argument that people coming across the US border illegally are taking advantage of the system by claiming asylum?
That's a great question that's raised by a lot of people who are concerned about the backlog. I think to just give a primer on asylum, in order to claim asylum, you have to be either present in the U.S. or at an official port of entry. That can be an official entrance along the border or at an airport. What we're seeing is large numbers of people are entering the U.S. unlawfully or between ports of entry to claim asylum. And they can do that. If you're on U.S. soil and you have a fear of returning to your home country because of persecution, the U.S. has a legal obligation to hear that asylum claim. But as we know, the system is overwhelmed and people are having to wait years for that decision to be made. And some attorneys that I've spoken with say that this has given the impression that the U.S. is somewhere where you can claim asylum and stay.
Mm-hmm.
And naturally, that's become a pull factor for migrants. But it doesn't mean that it was easy to get to the border or that they aren't fleeing really dire situations in their home countries. I think as long as the system is overwhelmed, people will have to wait years for a decision on their asylum claim, and that's not ideal. So that's why there's a push for some kind of immigration reform to make the asylum system more efficient and less of this waiting room.
Right. And that push has been going on for a long time, like years and years, with not too much progress.
Yes.
Another notion you'll hear is that higher immigration, and especially undocumented people coming to the United States, leads to more crime. Is there any truth to that notion?
So the research shows that there isn't a correlation between immigrants and higher levels of crime. Studies show actually the opposite. There's a Stanford University study that analyzed decades of data, and they found that immigrants are actually 60% less likely to be incarcerated. There's another study done by the Cato Institute that looked at crime data in Texas, and that showed that undocumented immigrants are 37% less likely to be convicted of a crime. And there's also the misconception that immigrants are bringing in large amounts of fentanyl and drugs through the border, but the Department of Homeland Security have said that a vast majority of fentanyl and other drugs are come in through official ports of entry or are brought in by U.S. citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Another argument against immigrants, and we know that folks have economic concerns top of mind, especially in an election year. Some people say they're taking away jobs from Americans. What are you hearing about that in your reporting?
Yeah, so that's also an assumption that's been essentially debunked by research. There's a report by the Economic Policy Institute that states in 2023 we saw the immigrant share of the immigrant share of the labor market reach a record high of 18.6%. At the same time, the unemployment rate of U.S.-born U.S.-born people hit a record low of about 3.6%. So what that study suggests is that immigrants aren't necessarily displacing U.S. workers; they're being absorbed by the labor force.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And there's also this argument floating around sometimes that undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes. What can you tell us about that?
So undocumented immigrants do pay taxes. There was a recent report by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy that shows in Florida, undocumented immigrants actually paid $1.8 billion in taxes. And a lot of that comes from sales tax and excise tax because we don't have an income tax here. So undocumented immigrants, like other citizens, they buy goods and services and they contribute to the economy that way. Another thing is immigrants, even without legal status, they're able to get an ITIN, an individual taxpayer identification number, and they can file taxes that way. So they can pay federal and state taxes. At the same time, they're not able to access a lot of the social services that receive money from taxes. So essentially, they're paying into a system that benefits mainly people with legal status.
Right. In your reporting, Nancy, what have immigrants and people who work in the system told you that they want? What do they want to change? What are their goals and dreams?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone at least wants the asylum system to work. The immigrants that I've spoken with, they don't like living in this uncertainty. A lot of the people that I spoke with, they've fled, violence and poverty and just really dangerous situations. So they want to be able to have an answer. Similarly, attorneys, they've said that their workload has increased over the years because of this backlog. And it's become harder for asylum officers to, make accurate decisions on cases at times. For years, the departments that deal with asylum and immigration, they haven't been funded properly. They haven't been staffed properly. So there needs to be some kind of immigration reform.
Mm-hmm. And from your reporting, what questions do you have after spending some time talking to folks about immigration here in Tampa Bay and reporting on the system and how it affects people in Tampa Bay?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have more and more questions the more I learn about how the immigration system works. I think the biggest question that arises is how are we not only going to fix the system here in the U.S., but how do we maybe implement policies that address the root causes that are causing people to migrate? Because we've seen administrations, implement deterrence policies to deter people from coming in through the border, but that doesn't work long term.
And politicians on both sides are focusing on immigration, sometimes resorting to fear tactics. Do you have some trusted resources where people can get data and information to help make informed decisions, say at the ballot box?
I would just say to do your research. Don't rely on social media or Facebook. One of my go-to websites is PolitiFact, where they give really neutral kind of assessments on what politicians might say about immigration. So I highly recommend that. The Migration Policy Institute is also a really good resource that explains how the immigration system works.
So do your research, essentially. Don't go into the ballot box without doing some digging and trying to figure out things for yourself.
Yes, definitely.
WUSF's Nancy Guan covering immigration. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Matt.
You've been watching Our Changing State Vote 2024. Thanks so much for tuning in. Our Changing State is a production of WUSF. Our executive producer is Gracyn Doctor. Scott Wachtler produces the podcast. Videos by Warren Buchholz and Chandler Balkcom, who also does our graphics. Engineering support from Blake Bass. Jackson Harpe composed our theme music. I'm Matthew Peddie. Thanks for listening.